Have you ever stood before a mirror in the dark and felt something watching you from the other side? That creeping sensation that the reflection staring back isn't quite yours anymore. There's a reason mirrors have terrified us for centuries, and the legend of Candyman taps into that primal dread like a hook, catching flesh. But this isn't just another ghost story whispered at sleepovers. The tale of Candyman, that vengeful spirit summoned by speaking his name 5 times into a mirror, is rooted in something far more disturbing than any screenwriter could invent. It's a story woven from real blood, genuine terror, and the darkest chapters of American history that many would rather forget. What you're about to read will change how you see that bathroom mirror forever. The man behind the monster. To understand Candyman, we must first confront the brutal reality that gave birth to him. The fictional Daniel Robitaille, the tortured soul at the heart of the legend, represents countless real victims of America's most shameful legacy. Picture this: the years following the Civil War, a period when freedom for formerly enslaved people was supposed to mean hope and new beginnings. But for many black Americans, particularly black men, freedom came with a terrifying asterisk. Daniel Robitaille's story in the film portrays him as the talented son of a freed slave who became a renowned portrait artist. His skills earned him commissions from wealthy white families, and it was through one such commission that tragedy struck. He was hired to paint the portrait of a wealthy landowner's daughter. Their sessions were long, intimate, the kind of proximity that allowed conversation to flow freely. Against every social prohibition of the era, they fell in love. When their relationship was discovered, the consequences were swift and merciless. A mob of enraged white men hunted Daniel down like an animal. They didn't simply kill him, that would have been too merciful. They wanted to make an example, to send a message that would echo through generations. First, they severed his right hand with a rusty saw, replacing it with a hook from a butcher's shop. Then came the honeycomb, smeared across his bleeding body, the sticky sweetness attracting every bee from a nearby apiary. Imagine his final moments, the searing pain of countless stings, his body swelling, airways closing, all while the mob watched and jeered. When the bees had done their work, they burned what remained of him. His ashes were scattered across the land that would one day become the Cabrini-Green housing projects in Chicago. This fictional account mirrors thousands of real stories that never made it into history. Books, The Unspeakable, History between 1877 and 1950. Over 4,400 documented lynchings of black Americans occurred in the United States. The actual number is likely far higher, as many murders went unreported or were deliberately concealed. These weren't quick executions, they were public spectacles of torture, often attended by entire communities, including families with children. The most common accusation: inappropriate contact with white women. A glance, a conversation, even a rumor was enough to seal a man's fate. Historical records document cases where black men were lynched for simply walking on the same side of the street as a white woman, for accidentally brushing against one in a store, or for succeeding in business and thereby threatening white economic dominance. The methods of torture varied, but they shared a common goal: maximum suffering and public display. Victims were mutilated, burned alive, and sometimes dismembered while still conscious. Photographs of these lynchings were sold as postcards, souvenirs, pieces of rope, clothing, even body parts were collected by attendees. This is the soil from which Candyman grew. The character of Daniel Robitaille isn't one man's story. He's an amalgamation of Jesse Washington, lynched in Waco, Texas in 1916 for an alleged crime he likely didn't commit. He's Claude Neal, tortured for hours before being hanged in Florida in 1934. He's Emmett Till, the 14-year-old boy murdered in Mississippi in 1955 for allegedly whistling at a white woman. The filmmakers of Candyman understood something crucial. True horror doesn't need invented monsters when human cruelty provides such abundant material. From Liverpool to Chicago, the literary origins that Candyman we know today began life in a very different form. In 1985, British horror author Clive Barker published a short story titled The Forbidden as part of his Books of Blood series. Barker's original tale was set in a dilapidated housing estate in Liverpool, England, and focused on themes of urban decay and class division rather than racial violence. The monster in Barker's story was a mysterious figure haunting the run-down council flats, a manifestation of the area's desperation and hopelessness. There were no bees, no hooks, and no racial undertones. It was a story about how poverty creates its own legends, how forgotten communities invent their own mythologies. When director Bernard Rose decided to adapt The Forbidden for cinema in 1992, he made a bold and controversial choice. He transplanted the story to Chicago and transformed it into a meditation on America's racial wounds. This wasn't simply a change of setting. It was a complete reimagining that turned a ghost story into a reckoning with historical trauma. Rose chose Cabrini-Green as his setting deliberately. The housing projects, built in the 1940s through 1960s with the promise of providing quality affordable housing, had by the 1990s become synonymous with urban blight, gang violence, and governmental neglect. The high-rise towers were crumbling monuments to broken promises, places where thousands of predominantly black families lived in conditions that would shock most Americans. The decision to set a horror film there was controversial, but Rose wasn't exploiting the residents' suffering. He was trying to make audiences confront it. Candyman became a story about what happens when society abandons entire communities, about the ghosts that haunt places where justice has been denied for generations. The ancient ritual of the mirror, long before Candyman. There was Bloody Mary, and before her, countless other mirror-based legends, stretching back through human history. The ritual is almost universal. Enter a darkened room, face a mirror and speak a name or incantation a specific number of times, then wait for something or someone to appear in the reflection. Sometimes it's a ghost seeking revenge. Sometimes it's a demon waiting to drag you to hell. And sometimes it's a glimpse of your own death. Why do mirrors terrify us so deeply? Ancient Romans believed mirrors could trap souls. Medieval Europeans covered mirrors when someone died, fearing the deceased spirit might become trapped in the glass, or that the living might be pulled into the realm of the dead through the reflective surface. Jewish tradition includes covering mirrors during Shiva, the mourning period after death. Even today, breaking a mirror is said to bring 7 years of bad luck. Superstition dating back to Roman times when mirrors were rare and valuable, but also considered magical objects. Psychologically, mirrors unsettle us because they present a version of ourselves that's both familiar and alien. We see ourselves reversed, our faces slightly asymmetrical in ways our brains don't recognize. In low light, our peripheral vision can make our own reflections seem to move independently. This phenomenon, called the strange face in the mirror illusion, has been documented in studies where participants staring at their reflection in dim lighting, begin to see monstrous or distorted faces, sometimes feeling as if they're looking at someone else entirely. The Candyman legend exploits this primal unease masterfully. The ritual requires you to be alone, to reduce the light, and to willingly invite the supernatural into your space. You're not just looking into a mirror, you're opening a door. The repetition of the name 5 times serves as both an incantation and a test of courage. With each utterance, you're committing more fully to the ritual, making it harder to back out. By the 5th repetition, your heart is pounding. Your palms are sweating, and every shadow in the room seems alive with menace. But unlike Bloody Mary, which children play as a game, Candyman carries the weight of historical trauma. You're not just summoning any ghost, you're invoking a spirit born from racial violence, calling forth the pain of centuries. The legend suggests that to say his name is to acknowledge the injustices that created him, and that acknowledgement comes with consequences. The real horror of Cabrini-Green, while Daniel Robitaille, is fiction. The terror experienced by Cabrini-Green residents was horrifyingly real, and one tragedy in particular cast a long shadow over the Candyman legend. On April 22, 1987, a woman named Ruthie Mae McCoy called 911 in a panic. She told the operator that someone was trying to break into her apartment through the bathroom mirror. The operator was skeptical, and police response was delayed. By the time officers arrived, Ruthie Mae McCoy was dead, shot multiple times in her apartment. At first, the story seemed impossible. How could someone enter through a mirror? But investigators soon discovered the horrifying truth about Cabrini-Green's construction. The buildings had been constructed quickly and cheaply. In many apartments, medicine cabinets were installed back to back between units, separated only by a thin pipe chase. It was possible, if you knew the building's layout, to remove a medicine cabinet from one apartment, crawl through the narrow space, and emerge through the cabinet in the adjacent unit. It was a structural flaw that turned every bathroom into a potential point of entry. Ruthie Mae McCoy's killer had done exactly this. He removed the cabinet in a vacant apartment, crawled through the wall space, and emerged in McCoy's bathroom. To her, in those terrifying moments before her death, it must have seemed as though someone was literally coming through the mirror. Her murder became a cautionary tale among Cabrini-Green residents. Mothers warned their children about the medicine cabinets. Some residents nailed their cabinets shut or placed heavy objects in front of them. The story spread and mutated, becoming more supernatural with each telling. Soon, it wasn't just a home invader using architectural flaws, it was a ghost, a demon, something that used mirrors as doorways between worlds. When Bernard Rose learned of Ruthie Mae McCoy's story while researching Candyman, he incorporated it directly into the film. In the movie, Candyman enters victims' apartments through bathroom medicine cabinets, blurring the line between the supernatural legend and the very real fear experienced by residents. This wasn't exploitation, it was acknowledgement. Rose was saying, the real horror isn't the ghost story. It's the conditions that make such deaths possible. Cabrini-Green was a place where systemic neglect created genuine horror. Elevators that didn't work, forcing residents to climb dark stairwells where gang members lurked. Broken windows that weren't repaired, letting in Chicago's brutal winter cold. Trash that piled up for weeks because the city refused to provide adequate sanitation services. Police who either ignored calls for help or responded with violence and suspicion. The residents didn't need supernatural monsters. They lived with real ones every day. Poverty, violence, governmental abandonment. and the slow grinding machinery of institutional racism. The power of belief in the film. Protagonist Helen Lyle is an academic studying urban legends. She approaches the Candyman story with scholarly detachment, seeing it as an interesting example of folklore. But as she digs deeper, she discovers something unsettling. The residents of Cabrini-Green genuinely believe in Candyman. They've seen him. They know people he's killed. The legend is alive in a way her textbooks never prepared her for. This reflects a profound truth about folklore. Legends survive because they serve a purpose. For the residents of Cabrini-Green, the Candyman legend provided several functions. First, it was a way to explain the inexplicable violence in their community. When a child went missing or someone was murdered and the police didn't care enough to investigate, the legend offered an answer: Candyman. It wasn't satisfying, but it was something. Second, the legend was a form of control. Parents used it to keep children from wandering into dangerous areas. Don't go into that abandoned apartment, that's where Candyman lives. It was more effective than explaining the realities of gang territories and drug deals. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the legend was a way of processing collective trauma. Every community that has suffered prolonged violence and neglect develops its own mythology. These stories are how people make sense of suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. Candyman became a repository for all the fear, anger, and grief that had nowhere else to go. In this sense, Candyman is real, not as a physical entity with a hook for a hand, but as a living idea, a shared narrative that shapes how people understand their world. The film suggests that belief itself has power, that if enough people believe in something, it takes on a form of existence. This is the most sophisticated aspect of the Candyman legend. It doesn't matter whether the ghost is real in an objective sense. He's real in the way that matters in people's minds, in their fears, in the stories they tell their children. The character of Helen Lyle learns this too late. By the film's end, she herself has become a legend, a cautionary tale, another ghost in the mirror. The boundary between investigator and myth dissolves. This is the true curse of Candyman. Once you engage with the legend, you become part of it. You can't study it from a safe distance. The story pulls you in, makes you complicit, and ultimately consumes you. Evolution of a legend, the Candyman franchise lay dormant for years after the original film and its sequels. Then, in 2021, director Nia DaCosta and producer Jordan Peele released a new Candyman that functioned as both sequel and spiritual reboot. This version introduced a radical reinterpretation of the legend. Daniel Robitaille was still the original Candyman, but the new film suggested something more disturbing. Candyman isn't one ghost, but many. Every black man wrongfully murdered, every victim of racial violence, every person killed by police or vigilantes or lynch mobs, they all become part of the Candyman collective. Each one adds to the hive, their pain and rage fueling the legend. The film portrayed the murder of a black man in the present day, showing how modern police violence connects directly to historical lynching. The methods change. Instead of a rope, it's bullets. Instead of a public spectacle, it's a body cam video, but the underlying mechanism remains the same. The 2021 Candyman argues that America has never stopped lynching black men. It simply found new ways to do it. This expanded mythology transforms Candyman from a simple revenge ghost into something far more complex. He's not just one man's pain, but the accumulated suffering of generations. He's the embodiment of cyclical trauma, the manifestation of a wound that's never been allowed to heal because we keep reopening it. The mirror in this version takes on new meaning. When you look into it and say Candyman's name, you're not just summoning a ghost, you're confronting the reflection of America's sins. The mirror shows us what we've done, what we continue to do, and what we refuse to acknowledge. Candyman appears not just to punish the individual, but to force recognition of these ongoing injustices. The stories we tell, so what is Candyman really? Is he a ghost? A legend? A metaphor? Perhaps he's all three. He's the ghost of Daniel Robitaille, the fictional artist murdered for loving the wrong person. He's the legend that arose from Ruthie Mae McCoy's tragic death and the very real fears of Cabrini-Green residents. And he's a metaphor for America's refusal to confront its history of racial violence. The genius of the Candyman legend is how it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. As a straightforward horror story, it works because it taps into our fear of mirrors, of dark spaces, of saying the wrong words and summoning something terrible. As a social commentary, it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about racism, poverty, and institutional neglect. But perhaps most powerfully, Candyman is a story about stories themselves, about how we use narratives to process trauma, to explain violence, and to pass warnings to the next generation. Every culture has its boogeymen, its cautionary tales, its monsters that embody collective fears. Candyman is America's monster, born from America's specific sins. The legend persists because the conditions that created it persist. As long as there's racial injustice, as long as communities are abandoned and neglected, as long as we try to bury uncomfortable histories rather than confronting them, Candyman will remain relevant. He's not just a character in a film, he's a cultural symptom, a manifestation of unhealed wounds. The mirror's final reflection: the next time you stand before a mirror, consider what you're really looking at. It's not just your reflection staring back. It's every version of yourself, past, present, and potential futures. It's your fears made visible, your secrets reflected in glass. And if you're tempted to try the ritual, to stand in the dark and speak his name 5 times, ask yourself what you're really doing. Are you testing a legend, proving your courage, or are you, perhaps unconsciously, trying to summon the past we've tried so hard to forget? The true horror of Candyman isn't that he might appear when called. It's that he never really left. He's been there all along, lurking in our peripheral vision, waiting in the shadows of our collective memory. The legend doesn't create him, it simply gives him a name and a story, making visible what was always present but unseen. Daniel Robitaille, Ruthie Mae McCoy, and the countless unnamed victims whose pain fuels the legend, they're all still there, reflected in that glass. Their stories demand to be told, their suffering demands recognition, and their ghosts demand justice. The Candyman legend teaches us that we cannot bury the past without consequences. The dead don't stay buried when their deaths have never been properly mourned, when their killers have never faced justice, when their names have been forgotten by those who should remember. They return again and again, manifesting in our stories and our nightmares, reflected in mirrors, both literal and metaphorical. So perhaps the real curse isn't saying Candyman's name 5 times. Perhaps the curse is in not saying the names of the real victims, the actual people who suffered and died while we looked away. Maybe the ghosts we should fear aren't supernatural entities with hooks for hands, but the ones we create through our silence, our forgetfulness, our willful ignorance of uncomfortable truths. The mirror is waiting. The question is, are you brave enough to face what it shows you? Because Candyman isn't just about summoning a ghost from the past. He's about recognizing that the past is never past, that history's horrors echo through generations, that the stories we tell, then the stories we refuse to tell shape the world we live in now. That's the real terror. That's the true story behind Candyman. And unlike the movie, there's no credits roll to bring us back to safety. This horror is real, ongoing, and reflected in every mirror we pass. Sweet dreams, and whatever you do, don't say his name.